Adam and Nightlight team for having me today. It's so great to be here as a visitor today. And I'm going to start with a little introduction today. And so let me just share my screen. So let's see if this works. Yes, so I'm going to start my little introduction that is actually inspired by a question that a student once asked me a couple of years ago, and she asked me, where do all the keywords for the planets come from? All of the keywords associated with Mars that I'm sure most of you are familiar with are here. And I thought, wow, yes, of course, what a great question that is. Where do these keywords come from? And as I was kind of dreaming about that, there was this other student who said, well, they're in the ancient source texts, of course. And I thought, well, that's not enough, right? We don't know the true source of these keywords. So that is what my little introduction will be about. And then, of course, I will get into Mars's journey in Cancer and Leo, his retrograde phase, and so forth. Okay, so what you see here is an image that I put together, and this is really my attempt to illustrate something that I saw a while back when somebody asked me to look into a specific topic that they had in mind without me knowing what that topic was. So this was like an exercise, and the idea was to simply let these sensory impressions come in without giving it any thought whatsoever, without creating any stories. And then I was supposed to write down the unfiltered, unedited information on a piece of paper. And the keywords that I wrote down were words like hot, red, strong, effort, movement, dry, rough, anger, energy. And in my mind's eye, I started catching glimpses of several men who all looked alike, and they were muscular and had beards, and they were sweating and definitely engaged in some kind of activity like doing some heavy lifting, or they were working on something in any case. And it just felt really hot out there as well. Now you can imagine my excitement when I found out that the target word that was given to me was in fact Mars. And the planet Mars, really, out of, and this was not in the context of astrology at all. And that was such an amazing experience. Because as soon as I learned this, it really dawned on me how it, that it was like as if I had paid Mars a visit in some way. It had felt like I had not invoked Mars, but I had been allowed to observe or even infiltrate Mars's world. And it brought up a lot for me. It was a very powerful experience. It was a true eye-opener for me in so many ways. And I want to stress first and foremost that this is actually something that all of us can do, right? Believe me, if I can do it, everybody can. And I had been doing exercises like this before. And when I first discovered that I could do this with verifiable target words, and that we can all do this, I was actually quite upset about not having discovered this any sooner in my life. Anyway, one of the reasons, at least, why this experience had such an impact on me was that it made me think of the possibility that our ancestors were very much aware of this ability, because again, it is a completely natural ability that everybody can learn and that we probably even do spontaneously. So suddenly it didn't strike me as awkward that ancient astrologers would simply list some keywords or give very concise descriptions when defining the planetary significations. And I remembered that ancient astrologers, like for example, Vedic Valens, frequently expressed their frustrations about astrologers before him not being clear enough, about not explaining astrological techniques, etc. We need to keep in mind that the ancient astrologers that we know actually based their knowledge on what they in turn called ancient astrologers. So we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, right? So the true source of all of this astrological knowledge is completely lost. However, having been fortunate enough to experience how this might have worked, I think that's an amazing discovery. And I think that is not that big of a stretch to think that the ancient astrologers had found methods and techniques to retrieve information in ways that are totally natural to human beings, but maybe not accepted today. And this opens up, I feel, some great possibilities for us astrologers in the 21st century, where we can rediscover how to access this knowledge. There are so many mystical traditions in both the Western and Eastern worlds with the same message, right? It's nothing new. They emphasize that we can retrieve true knowledge through inner journeys, visions, meditations, or altered states of consciousness, and so on. And probably most of us here today have already experienced this and know that sometimes information comes in mysterious ways. Plato spoke about accessing true knowledge through recollection or an inner vision of the so-called forms, which are the perfect or eternal truths beyond our empirical experience. And then there's, of course, the Hermetic tradition, which has its roots in Hellenistic Egypt and is therefore most relevant to us. Hermeticists also talk about, inner journeys to gain knowledge of the divine realm, deeply introspective processes, visionary experiences, dreams, meditative states. They were just as real as the material world. And we can actually see some interesting evidence of that in terms of what our ancestors knew about the stars without having access to the tools that we have now. For example, the star Antares was called Jeshta in Sanskrit, and that's a word that means the biggest, the eldest, or the most senior. Now, Antares is a red supergiant star in the heart of the Scorpion, and it's one of the largest known stars in terms of its physical size. It's actually anti-Aries, so it's a rival of Mars. That's what the name means. And so it's the largest star known in terms of its, its physical size, and it's also very, very old. So Antares' enormous size and evolutionary state as an aging star was only discovered through modern astronomy. In the sky, Antares is only the 15th brightest star, so there's really no way of knowing that Antares is really old and big by just looking at it. We know that older stars, we know now at least that older stars grow bigger and emit more red light. And the ancient Sanskrit designation of Jeshta accurately reflects these characteristics, as though people somehow intuitively understood that this star is old and large without having any access to modern astronomical tools. But yeah, just the fact also that the red stars in the sky were often considered old or dying stars is pretty amazing in itself, isn't it? Because that's also something that we found out relatively recently in the field of astronomy. Okay, so let's move on to the next. There are many examples like this. In any case, and I think all of these significations, at least in part, I think it might have come to us through inner journeys, and they knew that the world of the imagination was real. It's a real, accessible world. And of course, I am talking about imagination, not in the sense of just dreaming things up, not the imaginary. I'm talking about the imaginal reality in the sense of what people like Henri Corbin called the mundus imaginalis, which is a reality beyond the physical that connects the sensory and the abstract sections of being. It serves as a space of divine interaction and revelation and inner transformation. In other words, we don't have to physically go to a certain place in order to explore that place, and we don't have to make any measurements or calculations to find out important and meaningful information. So again, I am sure that most of you know all of the keywords that are associated with Mars. I've put the most important ones together here, like power and courage and anger, competition, effort, leadership, and so on. And we can think of all of these concepts as derived from one core principle. And I feel that at the heart of this collection of Martian keywords is the concept of action, or the process of doing. And you'll notice that all of these other keywords can all be logically derived from that primary concept of action. And then through reason, we can derive all of the other keywords from that core principle of action or energy. But just for fun, let's assume for a moment that all of these keywords were found by accessing that mundus imaginalis. And a really great way that I find, and that I think that's what ancient people might also have done, is that as soon as we give a body to an idea, we give it an autonomous life. In other words, we pretend that the principle of action is now a person. We think of what kind of body we would give Mars, with the idea in mind that it should be a body that is able to initiate action, that is able to get things done. So we can think of a healthy, more athletic or muscular, strong, robust body. What kind of mind will we give Mars? We better give him a quick mind with the ability to focus on the processes that need to be activated. What kind of spirit would Mars have? We can create an entire person who is completely autonomous. When we shape a body to envelop an idea, we give it life. Or another way of looking at it is, in order to understand Mars, we have to create a relationship with him. And the easiest way to do that is to imagine Mars as a person who you can then personally interact with. And you know, as above, so below, Mars expresses itself through things that correspond to action in each and every layer of our reality on a physical, mental, and spiritual level. Now, on a physical level, Mars governs physical strength and muscular power and the bravery and risk-taking that is needed to use that power so we can do things with strength, speed, and force. Mars activates the reflexes, the instincts, which represent the Martian principle, really in its purest form, right? Because a reflex is an action that happens entirely automatically. And when we need to respond very quickly to what's happening around us, it's great to have good instincts and reflexes. And it's about physical bravery and the determination to push through physical limitations or obstacles. In the natural world, of course, Mars' core principle of action manifests as the sprouting of new plants, how they are able to make their way through the soil, but also big events like wildfires, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, the primal instinctual drive in animals to chase down prey, and so forth. The mental level represents everything that is rooted in the intellect, as how we process and structure our experience of the world through thought, reason, and logic. And so on a mental level, Mars will activate the ability to make clear, assertive decisions, right? That's an action. He helps us cut through confusion and allows us to analyze situations decisively. Mars brings a focus if you're having a hard time sorting out your priorities, and he brings decisiveness where there is hesitation. Action also means the absence of rest, unfortunately, is a kind of restlessness, which is a characteristic that Mars shares with Jupiter, who is also a restless planet, because Jupiter embodies the principle of growth. But whereas Jupiter grows, and growing is an activity that incorporates and integrates ideas, Mars's action, his will to initiate movement, searches for the best solution. So Mars lets ideas compete with one another and then cuts away useless information. To distinguish between what is useful or not, we need to be critical. His mental agility empowers us to take focused, efficient action and to come up with bold strategies. And Mars also represents the courage to confront any inner challenges that we have, taking action to find solutions for unresolved emotional or psychological wounds. Mars is a fantastic therapist as well. He can initiate the destruction of outdated beliefs or patterns that so that we can rebuild ourselves anew. And on the spiritual level, then is how we connect to deeper truths, meanings, and experiences that go beyond thought. And here in this realm, Mars brings action in the form of serving as a catalyst for transformation and purposeful movement in life. Mars gives us the courage to face our fears and look into what we've been hiding from ourselves. Mars breaks through stagnation and shatters illusions. We often think of Mars as being impulsive, and that is true, but it's like the problem contains the solution as well, and Mars can take action to control impulsive behavior, not by suppression like Saturn might do, but by refocusing, redirecting that energy towards higher aims. Mars's action is not just about personal will, but about aligning one's actions with a higher will. And I know the word transformation is now associated with Pluto in our modern age, but in the traditional sense, it's definitely a Mars word. In alchemy, Mars corresponds to the active principle of transformation in many ways. So it's the chemist, the alchemist. Or you can also think of heat. Heat transforms things. On a physical level, we can think of soft batter transforming into cake when you heat it up and bake it in the oven. Mars is, of course, associated with cooking, not only because we use tools to do that, but also because of the chemical transformative process itself. The activity of eating transforms organic matter into energy. Mars represents our metabolism. We take all of that for granted, but it's pretty magical how things can be turned into something else, from food to energy, from gas to liquid, plants and trees converting carbon dioxide into oxygen. Mars corresponds to these types of chemical processes. On a mental level, Mars finds and sometimes creates problems through this restlessness, but a problem is also like a seed. The solution is already contained within the seed. In mathematics or in puzzles, for example, recognizing the structure of the problem or that often already reveals the path to solving the problem. And similarly, in personal challenges, the discomfort or the conflict itself reveals to us, shows us what is going on. And that in itself can guide us to the solution. that really is Mars's transformative power. So when you find Mars in your natal chart, think of where Mars is located in your natal chart. Look at the house it's in, the topics it represents, the houses it's ruling, the planets Mars is making an aspect to as well. That is where some great shifts can happen. And think of square aspects in general between any planets. Squares are of the nature of Mars and tend to be the most dynamic aspects that bring the most activity in the chart, right? Now, that all sounds as sweet as cherry cream pie. So why would Mars be categorized as a malefic planet in ancient astrology? We could say Mars and Saturn are the so-called malefics because Mars's excessive heat and Saturn's excessive cold can be dangerous or counterproductive if not handled with care from our part. Heat activates and action in turn creates heat. So there's a cyclical, almost self-regulating process there. While in Saturn's case, the cold freezes things to a stop. Mars and Saturn are the principles that can start and stop everything. Starting and stopping are the most radical changes we can think of, right? The beginning and the end are the extremities, the outside limits of all activity. Now, they are both extremes. So they are extreme, and the ability to start and stop processes of all kinds reveal incredible powers, if we think of it, And power can, of course, be very dangerous if not handled with care. So my take on it is that we as human beings, to fulfill our duty as human beings, we need to learn how to handle with care all the gifts we have been given by the gods, and that includes knowing when to start things and how to do that, why we do that, and so that it produces something that is good. I feel human beings are here to somehow digest the spiritual into the material, to transform it, the spiritual to the material world, and what we do with it in turns affects the spiritual realm as well. I think that's very much aligned with what the Hermetic tradition is all about. So Mars and Saturn happen to give us the most dangerous gifts, and we need to handle these gifts with care because human beings are the caretakers of this world. And even the ancient Greek word for weapon, hoplon, means that instruments, it's any instrument one uses to prepare or make ready. That's the definition of hoplon. It has its root in the verb hepo, which means to work or to be busy with. So this is about tools and instruments that we can use to take whatever type of action, and we can make tools for specific tasks, a hammer, a knife, etc. And later on, over time, the word for hoplon was being used more specifically in the context of warfare. So it got narrowed down a little bit, right? So I think it's interesting to keep that in mind. So it really illustrates how much of an ethical challenge it is to do good with tools that can also do harm. And it might be easier or more difficult to handle this Martian gift with care, depending on Mars's condition in your natal chart. When trying to remove an obstacle to bring about change, we might do more damage than we intended. And for example, a confrontation turns into an explosion, a debate or a fight escalates then into war. and so forth. And if Saturn cannot see Mars in the chart, Saturn cannot push against an escalation. And this is interesting to keep in mind because as long as Mars will be in Cancer, it will be in a line of sight with Saturn in Pisces. And this will change when Mars actually enters Leo. Then it's going to be in an aversion to Saturn. So a clear example, I think, of that is the event chart of the Chernobyl disaster. So yeah, look at that Uranus exactly on the ascendant at the time of the explosion of the reactor. There's, here's the modern planet's expression of our power plant. We can see the Sun-Pluto opposition on the 6th and 12th house axis. And the Sun happens to be in Mars's joy, the 6th house of accidents and injuries. In the traditional sense, this exalted Mars in the 2nd house of support and nutrition, that which gives us power, that is our power plant right there. Power is food, so energy. That's the 2nd house. Less than 2 days prior to the incident, there was a solar eclipse in Mars's sign Scorpio at 4 degrees, so very, very close to Pluto. And you'll notice that this exalted Mars in Capricorn is in an engagement with Jupiter. Mars is applying within 3 degrees to perfect a sextile to Jupiter. This is the actual activation that sets everything in motion. It's the catalyst of a chain reaction. And there was nothing to stop Mars as the sextile to Jupiter turns it into this huge growing explosion, right? And Mars's ruler Saturn happens to be in an aversion to Mars. Saturn cannot see Mars. And Saturn is, so Mars cannot see his host Saturn, and Saturn is also retrograde. So there is no way to stop this series of catastrophic events. I think this is a good illustration of why ancient astrologers thought of aversions, so planets that cannot see one another through a traditional whole sign aspect, were worse than challenging aspects. Since all things that we see here around us, everything corresponds to the planets, it's much more beneficial for them to work together. And so aversions really point to this connection. And so here is a good example of a negative effect of that. Anyway, it's also, to me, this is an example of human clumsiness when working with powers that you can't possibly control. But of course, there are also natural phenomena that can happen, like volcanic eruptions that correspond to Mars. And there's also, here is something that we can't do anything about. Just like there are natural processes in the body that are unpleasant, such as fevers or inflammation. Those expressions of heat are like tough love from Mars, who is trying to solve health issues in your body. Mars defends the body and gets rid of intruders. So when transiting Mars comes along and he conjoins your 1st house ruler, for example, just an example, you get to live with Mars for a while. You're suddenly transported into this activity zone, and things happening around you, inside of you, on the physical, mental, spiritual level. And the way in which this Martian energy enters your life very much depends on his environment. The sign Mars is in, so his essential dignity, and then some important accidental dignities, such as Mars's solar phase. In other words, how does his relative distance to the sun affect him? Is Mars combust or retrograde? The type of house he's visiting, the aspects he makes, counteraction, meaning is the ruler of Mars in a good shape here in the chart, and so on. That's a planet's general condition, and all of this will have an impact on our interpretation. And of course, I'm going to focus today on Mars in Cancer and Leo. The elements that impact the environment. So yeah, Cancer is a water sign and Leo is a fire sign. Mars is very familiar, right, with these elements of water and fire, because his domicile, Scorpio and Aries, are water and fire signs. In particular, Mars is familiar also with Cancer because he has triplicity rulership there by night, and Cancer is the home of the moon, which is nocturnal bisect, and so is Mars. So Mars and the moon play on the same team according to their sect status, you could say. But of course, there are important differences, and Mars is in its fall there. So again, Mars's environment is going to color Mars's natural way of being through action, and in turn, that action is going to color the sign of Cancer. Mars's presence there is going to impact the moon. It is a two-way street. I do, therefore I am. Okay, so dogs correspond to Mars, right? If you bring, let's say, yeah, you bring a dog into your home and it happens to be a high energy type of dog, very Mars, then your house is soon going to be destroyed if you don't find ways to somehow canalize all of that energy into something else, into some other more positive activity, because that energy wants action no matter what. And repressing is not a great idea, because then it becomes frustration or even illness maybe. So all of that Martian energy needs an outlet. And it's asking you to take the dog out for walks to make sure that he gets enough physical and mental exercise, but it's also asking you to take charge. When Mars is around, when you find yourself in a Mars type high energy kind of situation, we definitely need to step into a leadership position, whether we want to or not, and take control of the situation. If you look at where Cancer is in your natal chart, and you'll know through its house placement and through the condition of the moon in your chart, you'll know whether this is a house where things go really smoothly for you or where things can get a little more challenging from time to time. If Cancer represents a frustrating or a problematic area in your life, as could be the case in this particular chart here with the moon in her fall in the 6th house, that's a house associated with struggle, then transiting Mars will activate and confront you with that situation when he moves into Cancer. Mars will try to find solutions, though, and is ready to remove any obstacles for you there, is willing to fight if necessary, in the same way that Mars would try to fight off an illness through burning, viruses through fever. And sometimes things will happen spontaneously so that you need to respond, but other times the offer is just there on the table for you, and you're the one who is making the choice to go ahead with it or not. In order to take control over the topics that your Cancer house represents, Mars is going to be willing to form an opinion or conclusion based on incomplete information that inspires him to take action. Mars is a planet of conjecture because he would rather take a guess or follow his instincts than sit around and wait. He wants to do something, and uncertain or ambiguous situations are ideal because it presents a problem that Mars can then solve. He bridges the gap between what is known and what is imagined in a way. He often makes a shortcut a cognitive shortcut, if you will, to fill the voids of knowledge. We know that Mars is driven by an almost primal need to act before all the facts are in. And in Cancer's landscape, the facts always change, right? It's such a fluctuating environment there. So it's easy to see how that can be a little bit problematic. And the urgency to take action is so strong that Mars can be very impulsive and reckless. Now, let's say Cancer in your chart is in a nice house and everything in that area of your life is going to be, is going smoothly in general. All right, and now Mars pays a visit to that house. Well, in that case, Mars could shake things up for you because he would rather disrupt a situation and destroy something than not to do anything at all. And it makes me think of Newton's first law, which is the law of inertia, which states that an object will always remain at rest or continue moving unless something acts against it. So everything, and we could extrapolate that to people, has kind of a natural tendency to remain in the current state they're in. Well, Mars is there to disrupt that state because that's what action does. It counters the inertia. So Mars can disrupt the stillness, the peacefulness in that area of your beautiful chart, injecting movement, passion, and sometimes destruction to the situation. Mars will refuse to let things remain stagnant. Inertia is something to conquer, and Mars is that external force then acting on an object, situation, or person, compelling them to move, change, or awaken from rest. And that's a transformation again, but it can be harsh. And Mars, if he comes barging into a peaceful situation, he can be like the new dog in our living room, or a bored teenager, or like a rock star in a hotel who is destroying the place. So more specifically, Mars will stir, disturb, provoke, and challenge the values of his host. Mars can be very hostile to his host as well, and is going to provoke change that way. And that can lead to very controversial situations. And you'll notice that people with a very prominent Mars, and with prominent, I mean an angular Mars, and that's angular by whole sign or angular by degree. When Mars speaks loudly in the chart, then there's oftentimes going to be something very provocative or controversial about that person. A good example to illustrate that is the natal chart of philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer with Mars in Cancer in the first house. He is a perfect example of Mars's hostility towards the host. And we can think of hostility against the domicile ruler as well as the exaltation ruler. So the moon and Jupiter in this case. We know now that the moon represents the embodiment, the physical circumstances in our environments as well in any given chart. And Jupiter represents general support, faith, and optimism. And, he's the greater benefic, right? Both the moon and Jupiter are such important life-giving principles. Well, Schopenhauer now, with Mars's presence there in Cancer, is known for his extremely pessimistic worldview. And we can see this theme echoed in various places in the chart, of course. We always need some extra information, right? It's not going to be just every Mars in in Cancer. We have to take in the entire chart. Not only do we have Mars here, of course, disrupting Jupiter's natural indication towards a healthy contentment and faith, Jupiter here happens to be in detriment in the 12th house, right? And furthermore, Saturn is in the 9th house, ruled by that Jupiter, which can also point to a more challenging spiritual life, or at least, a darker, somewhat more pessimistic life philosophy, perhaps, or doubts or criticism. And Schopenhauer argued that human life is driven by an insatiable and irrational will to live. That speaks directly to Mars, the will, ruled by a debilitated Jupiter, insatiable, and here also in its exile or detriment, irrational, which inevitably leads to suffering and frustration. He believed that pleasures were fleeting and ultimately meaningless, so all of that is a direct attack against Jupiter. And now, why was this highly provocative at that time? Well, Schopenhauer happened to live in the Enlightenment period, which in general represented a great optimism about progress. And this is when, reason started dominating much of the European intellectual thought. So his unpopular, bleak view of existence attacked the optimistic environment of the time. Mars attacks Jupiter. He also had controversial views on death. Many philosophers of his time regarded suicide as morally wrong or even a sign of weakness, but Schopenhauer then argued that because life is filled with suffering, suicide was a reasonable choice for somebody who seeks to escape that suffering. Again, this goes directly against the life-giving principles of his ruler, the moon and Jupiter. And I'm absolutely not saying that Schopenhauer encouraged suicide, but it's more through Cancerian compassion, actually, that Mars understands the so-called solution to some people's suffering. He also expressed disdain for society and social norms. In other words, Jupiter's law and order. And there was also a lot of hostility, Mars, towards other philosophers, Jupiter again. The Martian drive to compete against his rivals was definitely present, and he had this notorious feud with Hegel. He absolutely despised him, and he was also bitter toward other philosophers like Fichte and Schelling. And this was not merely criticism, okay? This was very intense and unnecessarily combative, and it also totally backfired because Hegel was very popular while Schopenhauer's classrooms were almost empty. And there's also this other incident where he physically assaulted a woman who was talking loudly outside his apartment, and that irritated him so much, to such an extent that he pushed her down the stairs. So that reveals something about his temperament as well. Now I want to, so this is not for everybody, okay? And I want you also to keep in mind that this particular Mars here has actually just turned retrograde about 7 days before Schopenhauer was born. And that's a very intense phase. I'll come back to that later. So this is, quite a good example of that. My favorite Mars and Cancer example that embodies both the good and the bad is Philip K. Dick. Since Mars rules the first house, he truly embodies that Mars in Cancer. This is who he is, and you can imagine how in the fourth house of family, a big part of his character was shaped by his experiences at home. He came into this life with parents who were constantly struggling and fighting, and we can see the ever-changing emotional ambience at home and the conflict that Mars brings. Essentially, it isn't also an attempt to solve the problem. He internalized those struggles of his early childhood and translated them to later personal struggles with trust and intimacy. So there is something about these emotions that needed to be developed. And well, one expression of that is that he was married 5 times. Okay. So now, amidst these difficult circumstances early on in his life, he developed an incredible imagination. And that this is a positive side of the exaltation rulership of Jupiter there, right? An incredible imagination. And, he would later explore that in his writing, focusing on wonderfully thought-provoking, fascinating science fiction stories. You can tell I'm a fan. And he also had some major mystical experiences, and no matter how strange those experiences were, he had the courage to proceed deeper into that mystery and use conjecture to fill the gaps of the unknown. It was all very interesting. And I'm just focusing on Mars now, but of course there was a lot more to this chart, a lot more about not only Mars in the 4th house of what the ancients called the daimonion. It's also called the subterranean place, but interestingly also daimonion. So, and referring to our daimon, and also about, that interesting 9th house there, and how his chart reveals his understanding of reality and so on. I actually go really deep into that in my publication for Astrum Opus on Substack. If you want to check that out, you'll find it in the chart delineation section. I've become such a fan of his since I studied, just by studying his chart, actually. And I'm sure a lot of you know that it happens quite often that you pick stuff up from people when you're reading their chart. And for some reason, this chart was really special because the synchronicities kept coming as I was working on that article. And so I'm hooked. And yeah, and all of his work, he wrote so much, as we can imagine, with Mars and Jupiter's exaltation, that there's an abundance of productivity as well. Anyway, my point is kind of, when you're going through a rough period because of some transit, it can be illuminating to spend time with someone, whether for real or in your imagination, who has that placement natally. It's another way, and often a very playful way, of learning more about what that transit is all about for you. Now, I like to associate the ruler of Cancer, the moon, with magic. And the moon has a lot to do with remembering the past and the ability to relive the past by invoking emotions. Remember, Cancer is also the sign where Jupiter is exalted, and Jupiter, being a dreamer, aims for higher goals or some ideal order in the future. One magical way to reach those goals consists of imagining with your mind's eye and then adding strong emotions to those images. This is exactly, or evoking emotions through imagery, right? So this is what stimulates co-creation according to some magical traditions. We're continuously shaping old and new circumstances through the power of emotions. We do that spontaneously, so why not learn how to do it with more awareness? And Jupiter is a happy guest in Cancer because the moon offers him an abundance of fluctuating emotions that can be used for that magical growth. There's an incredible amount of power in emotions. It's severely underestimated. We can intensely relive past trauma as well as shape our future by controlling the imagery in our mind. And in ancient astrology, the moon as well as Mercury are associated with the mind, right? The intellect and the emotions. But the magical ingredient for success is our rich and powerful emotional landscape. And Mars now can help you take control over fluctuating emotions and bring focus and more passion to that magical imagination, cutting away imagery and ending mental and emotional habits that are unproductive. Mars always offers the courage to step into something new and to let go of the past, and without any regrets as well. That's the best case scenario, I feel. And sometimes this happens spontaneously, but oftentimes it does take a lot of self-discipline and practice, because emotions can also be very overwhelming, of course. And in fact, they're so powerful that they are pretty unstoppable and they can engulf us. Mars, being the ruler of Scorpio, knows exactly how powerful water is. Scorpio is a solid or fixed sign, and thanks to Mars's rulership, Scorpio's deep, intense emotional landscape is more controlled, right? It's strategic, persistent, certainly more calculated and focused. Now, notice how the moon and Mars are the only pair that are fallen or depressed in each other's signs, right? Mars is depressed in the moon's sign of Cancer, and the moon is depressed in Mars' sign of Scorpio. And this is not the case for any of the other planets. Saturn is depressed in Mars' sign, but Mars is depressed again in the moon's sign. Jupiter is depressed in Saturn's sign, but Saturn doesn't return the favor, so to speak. The Sun is depressed in Venus' sign, but Venus is depressed in Mercury's sign. But Mercury is depressed in Jupiter's sign. In other words, there's only one mutual depression or fall, and that's the one between the moon and Mars. And I can't help but think that this is has something to do with the mystery of fate versus free will. While we can co-create in a way, there's also something about the lunar web of fate that is impenetrable by Mars and cannot be dismantled by Mars. This is also what we hear from people who have memories of where they were before coming into a physical body, or people who have had near-death experiences. A lot of people were able to see how some events in their lifetime were very much fated. We don't have any control over certain threads in the web of existence in this realm. But at the same time, they also say that we can use our free will to do good. We can build beautiful things. Cancer is Jupiter's exaltation. I think the mutually fallen status of Mars and the moon might depict this mysterious perennial paradox, the impossible truth of the dance between fate on the one hand and free will on the other. But what is fallen can get back up again, and there's an incredible strength behind fallen planets in the chart. Oftentimes, they make the impossible possible as our topics, themes, and stories fall apart, and we have the opportunity to put it all back together again in a better way. This long time that Mars is journeying through Cancer is the perfect time to experiment and use Mars's willpower and tools to direct your mind's eye towards the imagery that you like to see, and steer and build the richness of your emotions to support that imagery. We often think of Saturn giving us the necessary self-discipline to do that, but Mars too has incredible self-mastery and never retreats. I mean, he is the warrior god who commands armies, so of course he has that power of self-discipline and control. On December 7th, where I live, and on December 6th, I think for all of you in the United States, Mars will turn retrograde at 6 degrees of Leo. So by the time that Mars enters Leo on November 4th or November 3rd, for a lot of people, Mars will already have slowed down significantly. And I'll actually come back later to Mars's journey in this chart. As Mars is slowing down, and he's already doing so like a real trooper, of course, he's not giving up and crawling forward, frustrated by losing his speed, but also weakened a little. That's what ancient astrologers thought about slower moving planets. Their powers have weakened considerably. Mars's characteristics of energy, action, and drive specifically govern the essential components of metabolism, and I mean metabolism in the broadest sense, in the same way that our metabolism breaks down nutrients to fuel the physical body. Mars transforms the input of raw materials into an output of active power. When metabolism is disrupted, the body struggles with energy production, right? So we can effectively feel more tired as Mars slows down, and that could manifest as apathy, burnout, lethargy. We may struggle to muster motivation or willpower, or simply, lack the energy to do something. So Mars already slowing down in Cancer can disrupt how we process emotions. So the inability to metabolize emotions properly may result in things like repressed anger or leading to internal frustration, or the opposite, which could be explosive outbursts since emotions are not appropriately channeled. Again, Mars's fire needs a proper outlet through action. If stifled, Mars's fire is going to fester. If uncontained, it oftentimes burns too wildly. So action becomes slow and perhaps clumsy because we're missing Mars's agility and focus, and that'll in fact worsen when Mars will turn retrograde, because Mars will be swept away by the primary motion, losing his self-agency in a way. And we feel that Mars no longer has the ability then to help us in an efficient way. In other words, we'll be on our own when it comes to taking action. This is also one of the reasons why Mars is associated with accidents and injuries. These are basically, this is action gone wrong, right? Mars can also be seen as a malefic because when Mars slows down or changes direction, we're missing that powerful tool that we need. We need to pay more attention to our actions because Mars is no longer there to help us in the most efficient way in all of our activities. The same goes for all retrograde planets, right? Just think of Mercury turning retrograde. We need to think twice about everything. There's usually some rescheduling that needs to be done, or technical stuff is failing us because we're missing Mercury's help taking care of all of these things, governing all of these types of things. So retrograde planets often teach us how to take better care of things ourselves. And so it takes more time sometimes to do that, right? That explains the delays. I'll come back to Mars's retrograde journey in a minute, but first let's think of Mars in Leo for a moment. So again, wherever Mars is in your chart, there's going to be this heat, this restlessness that makes things happen, that brings action to that area in your life. Mars tends to work on solutions if it's in a place that is really challenging for you, even though that change in itself is really hard sometimes. Contrastingly, if Mars visits a place where everything runs smoothly, then Mars is going to introduce something new, perhaps because it cannot stand inertia or stagnation. Since Mars has already slowed down so much upon his entrance into Leo, the first passage through Leo can be disruptive in the sense of uncoordinated, inefficient action. Remember, Mars challenges his host, and in Leo, Mars only challenges the sun this time because Leo does not have an exaltation ruler. So what does the sun represent that Mars might want to challenge? Well, above all else, the sun represents authority. Positive solar authority offers a stabilizing force. On the physical and emotional level, authority represents a sense of groundedness and protection. On the mental level, the sun manifests as a capacity to illuminate and provide clarity. This solar type of authority brings wisdom and has the ability to guide others with reason, insight, and discernment. So thanks to the sun, we can see, and seeing is understanding. It involves the wisdom to know what is true, what is helpful, providing knowledge that enables others to think critically and independently. And so that's a positive, constructive type of authority that offers clear guidance. On the spiritual level, good solar authority is firmly tied to wisdom, integrity, and the alignment with higher principles. The sun's presence in your natal chart, find out where the sun is in your chart. That's a place that, where the sun naturally inspires you to seek a deeper connection to the divine or the sacred. And the sun does not want to have power over others. The sun is self-reliant, self-sufficient. Soul is solo, doesn't need anybody, really. It's about embodying universal truths and in an indirect way, helping others to connect to their own inner wisdom then. So leading by example is another way of saying that, right? So that people can find their own authenticity and their purpose, their sense of purpose. So on all levels, solar authority is about empowerment. And if the sun is prominent, so angular in your chart by sign or degree, there is sometimes a very challenging mission in your life that emphasizes how true authority is earned through integrity, competence, and wisdom. It's about being a steward rather than a ruler, and is the kind of authority that serves to empower rather than to control. So Mars in Leo is going to challenge authority first and foremost, wherever Leo is in your chart. And for Mars, judging what is true or not is less important. Mars is more inclined to go ahead and take control and stepping into a position of authority, even if Mars does not yet see the truth of it. But Mars is very familiar with fire, though, because he governs another fire sign, Aries, which is the exaltation of the sun. And even though Mars has no essential dignity in Leo, he's doing pretty well there in general, because the ruler of Leo, the sun, offers more stability than the moon's fluctuations in Cancer. The sun supports willpower and leadership, and those are things that Mars can certainly get behind. In Leo, there can be a more sustainable martial force. Energy can now crystallize into something more defined. Mars is presented here with the opportunity to channel this energy toward long-term goals and toward building a legacy. So in Leo, Mars's drive is also a little more purposeful, because purpose is a concept that is associated with the sun. And also, Mars in this solid fire sign can control fire to such an extent that Mars can refine and process things through, or process rough things, really rough matter, things to deal with. There's our transformation. Again, building something that endures the test of time is very Leo-like. That's a possibility in that very creative sign of Leo, right? The sun always has a purposeful vision, and Mars can then help channel that vision into creation. Solid fire is slower, it's deliberate, and it can show up to demonstrate individual greatness. So Mars in Leo, wherever Leo is in your chart, can help you build your sense of purpose in life as well. Mars's actions in Leo are going to be focused on that grand, lasting solar vision. And a really good example chart to illustrate that is Rupert Sheldrake's chart. Now, Sheldrake is a controversial biologist. He's a Scorpio rising, so he is that Mars in Leo in the 10th house, ruled by the sun in the 9th house of education. And what's interesting about that is that Mars challenges his host, the sun in the 9th house. And this is expressed in Sheldrake's life through his criticism of scientific dogma. You will notice that the sun is with Jupiter here, and Jupiter is always about belief systems, ideology, and big institutions and establishments. And so here we see the sun very closely involved with Jupiter in the 9th house of education. And that represents a successful life story that revolves around higher knowledge and learning. But that has also to do with an exalted and thus exaggerated institution in this case, because this beautiful combo is being challenged now by the sun's guest, Mars. Sheldrake criticizes materialistic science, which to him is overly mechanistic and very dismissive of alternative or unexplained phenomena. And he, as the Scorpio rising with Mars in the sun sign, desires true insight. So Mars, our DIY god, is not going to sit around. In Leo, he wants to shed light on things and doesn't close his eyes for theories that are provocative or phenomena that are not accepted by an inflated ideology, as Jupiter might express here. He's going to confront those mysteries, and he's going to look for alternative explanations, a more direct path to an explanation. He wants to look into things that come from people's direct experiences. Mars truly honors direct experience. And he proposes solutions, explanations in a way that challenges the established authority on science. In Leo, it's more about truth and legacy. What kind of mark am I going to make on the world? It has to be something I can be proud of. And we get a very interesting dynamic here where these planets, of course, play several roles. Jupiter is not only about, scientific dogma. That's just one side of it. Jupiter also plays a very important role in forming these ideas that Sheldrake has and his philosophy, growing his understanding and insight in the 9th house. And he came up with something very Jupiterian, actually, because he suggests that there are morphic fields, which are kind of a collective, collective memory or field of information, so something expansive, that influences how organisms develop and behave. That's a lunar quality right there, the development of organisms. So this idea that speaks to some kind of collective field is very much Jupiter in Cancer. And Sheldrake suggests that consciousness is not confined to the brain. So again, here we can see the boundlessness of Jupiter. And this actually ties in with what I spoke about earlier when I talked about my personal experience in human beings having the ability to tap into a field of information. So I thought it was pretty amazing. So Sheldrake's take on things is very controversial, and mainstream biologists and physicists reject his ideas for the most part. He's been heavily criticized, and we can see that in this daytime chart. Mars is damaging his reputation in the public sphere in the 10th house. And I think the only reason why he has, a voice in the scientific community itself still is exactly that beautiful promise of success that Jupiter is offering there. So there's many sides to that Mars and Jupiter. And you'll notice that actually that there are many scientists with natal charts where Mars plays a big role. As Mars offers these tools to solve problems. And there are quite a few people throughout history that have sparked controversy by challenging conventional scientific, philosophical, or cultural views. And these people oftentimes have a very prominent Mars, such as Galilei with Mars and Taurus in the 10th, or Nikola Tesla with Mars in Libra in the 6th, squaring the degree of the MC. So both with Mars and Venus's signs. Venus is also a goddess who seeks truth, because truth is beauty for Venus, all right? Anyway, so again, Mars's first passage through Leo from November 3rd or 4th through January 6th is likely going to be a little clumsy. The inefficient distribution of Martial heat can create some problems. It's almost as if Leo, wherever it is in your natal chart, will have to cope with an unstable or dysregulated metabolism. But then with his second pass, when he's direct again, there's going to be more of a constructive buildup, but that won't be until April 18th, when Mars finally enters Leo again after his long retrograde period. And I'll summarize the different stages of Mars's journey in a minute at the end of this talk. So I'm just briefly touching on this. Let's get into Mars's retrograde journey first. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of retrograde planets, where there is some sort of revision, reevaluation of past decisions and experiences. It's usually a time of delays or reversals of fortune. Remember, this is in great part because the planet loses its self-agency as it's being carried away by the forces of the primary motion. A retrograde planet is no longer forging its individual path through the secondary motion. So in essence, we miss the planet's power as a caretaker of all of the topics it represents. And we're suddenly left to our own devices. And that's the reason why things may take longer, right? We experience delays. We miss that planet's power. Now, when Mars turns retrograde, there is really a deeper dimension to it. And I thought a good way of illustrating that could be by contemplating Mars's function as the alchemist and comparing his retrograde journey with an alchemical concept. This concept of solve et coagula is a principle that refers to the processes of some kind of dissolution first, dissolution, and then coagulation, which symbolically describe breaking something down into its essential parts and then recombining them into a purified whole. And I think that this concept fits perfectly with Mars as a planet of action and transformation. And I think that those big changes can come about during Mars's retrograde cycles. And in particular, in the phase when Mars turns direct again and picks up speed. And obviously, in general, the retrograde cycle also means that a planet is going to be in a sign for much longer, right, than usual. And this automatically intensifies a planet's presence in a certain sign or house. And in this case, specifically on this journey, Mars is going to spend most of his time in Cancer. So Mars is initiating the breaking down of structures, patterns, or identities that we can find in Leo and Cancer as he's moving retrograde. And after breaking down these patterns or dissolving them, destroying them, to use a very Mars word, he's going to dismiss the ones that no longer serve any purpose. And after that process, he's going to turn direct again and pick up the parts that he can still use. And it's going to rebuild those parts into something new and maybe create new parts and put them all together to construct something new, to pioneer and venture into something new. Thanks to the choices we make during this period of time, using our free will. So it's going to turn it into, or we can turn it into something much stronger or more pure, more aligned with our true will and our best interests. Mars will make new tools or weapons for us to face new challenges or to just go about our business. So phase one, right now, Mars is, of course, already well into Cancer. It's in the 24th degree today. So Mars is already in that area of the zodiac he'll return to later. This means that this is a good time to prepare for Mars's retrograde journey. There was a time that there's a time that we can create more awareness around anything that has to do with lunar things, such as our emotions, our family situation, our current circumstances, our day-to-day environment, and all of the topics of the house that Cancer falls into in your chart. We're encouraged to feel deeply, to not back away from certain feelings, because there are no taboos for Mars. It's a good time to practice staying with your emotions rather than rationalizing them. And it's actually also a good idea to find and face problems so that Mars does not have to find them for you or create new ones. So honestly, this is a good time to be proactive as well, although it might not be that easy as Mars is already slowing down. We might, not have much energy to go for it. But the reason why I say that it's a good idea to be proactive is that we will be facing a very intense Mars-Pluto opposition that adds a lot of power to Mars's journey. Like everything, this can be for good or for bad, with the Mars-Pluto opposition coloring significant parts of this particular Mars transit through Cancer and Leo. His journey is much more intensified because Mars is moving so slowly, and so it's not a quick opposition. Pluto is finishing up his work in Capricorn, and then the sign of Capricorn, which is Saturn's domain. So this is a lot about the consequences of past actions and past circumstances that Mars is addressing here. I did a podcast on Pluto and Capricorn on Substack, so I'm not going to go too much deeper into this because we're kind of running out of time as well. But in the context of Mars's journey, it's important to know that Mars, as the god of action, is going to activate Pluto in a major way, which means that you need to see what's going on there in your chart so that you can kind of help Pluto wrap things up in that area of your life. If there is unfinished business there, it's time to get it done. The Mars-Pluto opposition is actually going to perfect 3 times, right? And so the first one is already forming, actually. The first opposition will be exact on November 3rd. And this is happening in the very last 15 minutes of Mars in Cancer. Of the 3 oppositions, this is going to be the only one on the Cancer-Capricorn axis. The other Mars-Pluto oppositions are going to be happening on the Leo-Aquarius axis, which is an aversion to Saturn, and who is able to slow things down and do things with responsibility. We know that Mars is or could be unstoppable if it's not connecting with Saturn. Remember the Chernobyl chart? And it doesn't need to be that tragic, of course, but I think the symbolism speaks to that. And notice how, some things in your life, might get out of hand if you don't change direction. So I encourage everybody to cultivate a healthy dose of suspicion this time, right? It's okay to think about what could go wrong, but not in a scared way, not in a way that frightens you, where we get swept away by speculation or going round and round imagining worst case scenarios. No. We want to do this in a nobler Mars-like way. We can take on a Mars-like attitude and prepare with care. Preparation is half the work. So healthy suspicion in the sense of remaining cautious, but not only towards other people who are, of course, also experiencing this opposition, but also towards yourself, right? To check in with yourself, to see if there is something that is brewing below the surface that is about to erupt, because that's what often happens, that our curiosity or interest in something turns into something bigger, sometimes an obsession, or some regrets might develop within people into a desire for revenge and stuff like that. So essentially, this Mars-Pluto opposition is enhancing that energy and that drive to do something. So it's good to keep your eyes and ears open. Just take in what is happening around you. Make sure that you are in safe space, and then find ways to channel that tense energy in the best of ways by, focusing on the things that are happening, focusing on more fun things, take care of things in the best way that you can. But keep in mind, again, that this might not necessarily be dramatic, right? Look at the house placements. You might want to make sure that if Mars is in the 4th house, for example, that you take care of that old issue with the plumbing in your house sooner rather than later. It can simply be something you overlooked in your environment that needs some attention. Pluto makes work of things that we have neglected. So this may come up, and it's a good time to prepare, because we're going to revisit this opposition throughout Mars's journey here. And by the way, this doesn't mean that this entire journey of Mars will be infused with that Pluto energy. And the Mars-Pluto opposition can mean that some of the changes that are happening are really crucial and long-lasting and very important transformations in your life. And oftentimes we see that there are a lot of different things happening at the same time, and they are not always connected. There are going to be many different expressions, smaller and greater expressions of the different phases in this transit. The location of Leo in the birth chart is a place that always challenges us to be real, to be genuine, so that we always act from true self-agency. It's a place where we are loyal to our higher purpose. For the ancient Greeks, the sun was associated with the daimon, who compels us to follow our deepest purpose. So when Mars comes along and makes an important transit through Leo like this one, Mars can potentially open old wounds. And one typical Leo wound can be, for example, that your search for authenticity is hurt by negative experiences or interactions with other people who hurt your dignity, your value, your pride and self-respect. It might hurt when you're doing your best in that area of your life, but you don't receive any recognition or validation, or you receive criticism instead for your work, or for simply trying to be your best and most beautiful, authentic self. some people or circumstances can suck all of the joy out of a playful Leo heart. So keep that in mind. And now Mars can make such a wound or open an old wound, right? Especially around his stationing point at 6 degrees in the first 2 weeks of December. He could make it burn so hard that you're forced to do something about it. Mars is going to bring urgency to any lingering issues there. So the next phase, when Mars turns retrograde at 6 degrees of Leo, initiates the Solva phase. And I think that would be a great opportunity to just kind of meditate on what kinds of things could be dissolved in that area of your life where Leo is in your birth chart. What are some of the things that you find there that no longer bring you that natural solar playfulness and happiness? You can ask Mars to dismantle that gently. The retrograde station of Mars forces the urgency of reflection so that we can break down, shatter illusions, get rid of certain patterns. And when Mars stations retrograde, we might get a spectrum of almost random seeming Martian things happening all at once. It's like Mars is out of control, but the energy is still there. So it's like all sorts of activity gets misdirected. Very common expressions of this moment could be things like, on the physical level, there might be a migraine, or there might be some inflammation or a fever that seems to come out of nowhere. On a mental level, there might be symptoms of a burnout of some sort. On a spiritual level, there might be this overwhelming sensation of powerlessness. Those are just examples of what it is like for us to go about our business without Mars's help. When a planet stations retrograde, it's almost as if we're like kids who no longer have the guidance of a parent or caretaker. So we have to take on responsibilities that we're not really ready for. A retrograde station has a very Saturnian quality to it, right? Because the planet comes to a complete standstill in the sky from our perspective. That's very Saturnian. The stationing moment halts that planet's guidance. And that means that we have some maturing to do, that we need to show up with Saturnian perseverance, that we are going to have to put a lot of effort into everyday things that we take for granted when Mars is there just being his old self. Now, the Solva stage is definitely well on its way here in this fourth phase, and this phase of dissolution and disintegration is often uncomfortable because this uncontrolled Mars energy can cause disruptions, and the Sun, as a ruler of Leo, generally prefers to overlook problems and throw some light and love on them instead. The Sun doesn't really want to spend time on difficult issues because the Sun doesn't see darkness. Everywhere the Sun looks, he's shining his own light. There is no darkness for the Sun. He literally obliterates the dark each day, right? Mars's energy, is now more geared towards breaking down things. So destruction versus construction. It's a way in which Mars removes obstacles, but since he loses direction and self-agency, because he's now being swept away by the primary motion, it also means that we have the responsibility to find out what our priorities are in our day-to-day life and make more effort, and that can translate again to periods of exhaustion and sudden surges of energy that are kind of misdirected, because Mars is so important for our metabolism, right? For the most part, this is a time where we can simply let things fall away, because a lot of the retrograde motion is going to then clear the path for when Mars returns after stationing direct. And this clearing of the path is, of course, also very much intensified again by our second Mars-Pluto opposition, which perfects on January 3rd. And this opposition, this particular opposition may entail a big purge, a cleansing, a removal. Pluto has the upper hand now because Pluto is going to be direct and Mars retrograde, and that puts Mars in a weaker position because some of his activities might be misdirected, and we need to be careful that during this particular transit, we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. It could mean that people will be taking more drastic actions than necessary, oftentimes out of a sense of powerlessness. So that is so dangerous because when we feel powerless, we might overcompensate by doing too much or by doing something too radical as well. And then Mars is going to move back into Cancer to bring that same process of dissolution to the moon's sign. So now the focus is redirected to our emotional life and, of course, all of the topics of the house where you find Cancer in your birth chart. Released from this intensifying opposition to Pluto, this could be a really good opportunity to ask yourself some questions. Do we have memories from the past that are lingering, that are haunting us? Are there any lingering emotions? Do we still feel frustration when we remember certain things that have hurt us emotionally? What kinds of wounds do we have in the moon's house that are connected to family or our environment where we want to feel safe? Do we have a place where we belong? What wounds do we need to heal? Do we have any defense mechanisms built around our emotions? Mars can open up old wounds, create new ones, or to be more precise, it's not Mars who is creating wounds. It's more that we miss Mars when he's being carried away in that retrograde motion. He's not here in his full capacity to quickly solve problems. So we're left to our own device. And so indirectly, this new situation is forcing us to do something about some of the circumstances we find ourselves in. Now, since the retrograde station happened in Leo, Mars is bringing some of that event into Cancer. And this is pretty big because the sun's domain is now involved, right? And as most of you know, the sun describes the big storyline of our life. And that's significant in this context because when Mars goes back into Cancer, it's going to address the big storyline of what's happening in the area where Cancer is in our chart. So I'm looking at the entire Mars journey as a whole here. Mars is, of course, going to address all or any of the natural significations of the moon, such as family or environment, your home, your property, your community, the collective, your relationships in general, and how you can care about people and care for people, and how you show up for others and nourish them with whatever you have in your authentic self, and whatever you have to offer that aligns with your sense of purpose. So Mars might bring some of the sun in there. Mars in his mission to remove obstacles can break down emotional blockages and any Cancerian protective shells so that you can resolve some things and then act from a place of emotional integrity rather than reactivity or self-defense. So Mars turns direct again at 17 degrees of Cancer. That's a new starting point that announces a time of reconstruction. The coagula is initiated, and with every step, with every degree, as Mars will gain more power and is gradually gaining more speed, he's going to use the essential parts that are left behind, and he's going to create something new there. How will you express yourself? How will you assert yourself in a way that is aligned with your emotional integrity? How can you fulfill your emotional needs and those of others? We get a chance to redefine all of that as Mars is going to pick up the good pieces that were left behind and then add some helpful new tools. So we can, how can we master or take charge of what needs to be done? What's a better and shorter martial path to success in those areas? What kind of solutions can we try out and experiment with them? And with every step, Mars can try out things, and if it doesn't work straight away, no worries. Mars can always leave behind the past without any regrets and start over. So during the rest of this journey through Cancer, Mars is still going to move very, very slowly. So that also means that this might be actually a phase in Mars's journey that we might underestimate. Because when a planet like Mars, which is a fierce planet, full of passion and fire, when Mars has gone through a long retrograde period like that, what is going to happen is that Mars is very likely to be very frustrated. It's almost as if a retrograde Mars is a kind of, it's been unable to act like his usual self. So he's going to show up as if he needs to make up for lost time. So he can be impatient and angry. And again, this is a disturbance of metabolism, so to speak, in the broadest sense. All right. So we can expect some excessive outbursts because of pent-up energy, because Mars is looking for a release of some of that frustration he experienced. And so I see that it's getting late, so I'm going to move a little bit more quickly through this. So we can expect some ups and downs here, well, because Mars is still recovering from his retrograde journey. And some sources in the traditional text say that a planet stationing direct can be considered as a patient who is recovering from a long illness. And so you know that there will be some ups and downs, and we'll all have to exercise patience as there will be quite a long period of instability. So when Mars moves out of the sign where he is depressed, it's not quite over yet. This is a time, and based on Mars getting back to his normal speed, this can take up until the end of May. And during that time, we still need to be very careful, thoughtful, and aware, because we might think too soon, like, oh, Mars is moving direct again, problem solved. Well, on the contrary, while the coagula, the restoring part, is happening, the situation is actually very sensitive. Mars is definitely going to restore things or build up things, but if we push it too hard too soon, we'll notice that what we have built might not be entirely stable yet and could have some negative consequences. And this is, of course, also exacerbated by the final opposition between Mars and Pluto that will become exact on April 27th at 3 degrees on the Leo-Aquarius axis. That's it. I've come to the end of my presentation, and I have to say, when I was preparing this, I realized once again how endless Mars's realm is, and honestly, there is so much more to say about Mars and about this transit. I will, of course, continue to talk about Mars or write about Mars, and I will do that on Substack. I have 2 publications there. My personal publication is Michelle's Midheaven, and then I also publish forecasts for the full moon and chart interpretations for Astrum Opus, and Saffron is also a writer there. And that's a great place where we're building a community. We're offering opportunities to get together. We have a salon where we discuss transit, Astro Explore where we discuss charts, so please check that out. I recommend accessing these pages, by the way, through my website, michellesmidheaven.com. And certainly if you would like to follow me on Instagram or Facebook, because my work has been copied. And so I know there are fake accounts out there. So visit my website to make sure you have the right one. And also visit my website if you would like to have a more specific and a personal approach, because I can only talk about the general flavor of this big Mars transit, and there's so much to it, and it's going to be quite unique for each one of us individually. So Please know that I offer natal chart readings, horary readings, synastry readings, and I'm also going to be giving talks and workshops for beginners, intermediate, and advanced students. And the next thing on my schedule is a 2-part workshop on combining profections and solar returns that I'll be giving on November 10th and 17th. This is a workshop that I gave in July, and since quite a few people have contacted me since to ask me if I'd be willing to do this again sometime, here it is. I'm offering this once more. I've got lots of other things lined up for you. So keep in touch, become a subscriber to Michelle's Midheaven on Substack, whether you're becoming a free or a paid subscriber. I always offer discounts to my subscribers. And you also get a discount when you schedule a reading with me if you are a paying subscriber. So I thank you so much for joining me today. And I will be so happy to answer some questions if there are any.